Did he strike you as being a very conventional kind of Englishman or as a very different kind of Englishman?
No, he struck me as being with it at that time.
What kinds of things now made you feel that about him?
I think he was ahead of his time. I think he had lots of pep, and I think he was very much ahead of his time. I think he wanted to establish things that were a little not ready for them, really, perhaps.
After you'd abdicated, sir, you had two jobs, didn't you, in rapid succession?
I was appointed governor of the Bahamas. We occupied Government House, Nassau, for almost 5 years.
How did you enjoy being out there, ma'am?
I liked it very much. Wonderful climate.
Interesting, rewarding.
Interesting, very rewarding. I ran a canteen, 2 canteens there for the RAF. And when they were leaving, they were going to give me a present. So the Duke knows that I'm speechless, which I'm sure the television audience will know that I'm speechless in front of anything. So he had to give the secret away. It was to be a secret. He told me that he said they're going to give you a silver box, and I thought they wanted to be a surprise, but I knew that you wouldn't be able to open your mouth when they presented it, so I warned you.
And what happened?
Well, I said a few simple words.
Would you like to have gone on and had another job after that, sir?
Yes, I offered my services if they were required. Never got any.
Would you like the Duke to have had a job?
Oh, yes, very much, very much.
In those days, that's 25 years ago.
I think he could have done something.
Why didn't you get a job, do you think?
I don't know. Have to ask. Most of the people, I think, I'm afraid, are underground now who prevented me. It's hard to say.
Do you have any regrets when you look back on your life?
Oh, about certain things, yes. I wish it could have been different. But I mean, I'm extremely happy, and naturally we've had some hard times, but who hasn't? So you just have to learn to live with that.
Duchess, what is the secret of keeping and looking young?
Well, I don't know. I'm not the secret yet. I think happiness is a great secret, too. How you feel and look, perhaps. We've been very happy.
Yes, I have.
Would you describe yourself as a reforming king when you occupied the throne?
No, I wouldn't. I wanted to be an up-to-date king. That was... But I didn't have much time to...
No, and you didn't have, as it were, you didn't have political conceptions about how the country should be.
I had lots of political conceptions, but I kept them to myself. That is the tradition of the royal family.
What were the things that you wanted to change? Could you give me some examples of the ways in which you ran up against the conventions of your time?
Well, I think it was more... well, I wasn't there. I didn't have time. I wasn't there long enough. But I had in mind to change, especially to do with the court, which, after all, the court is dominated by the king, and he influences the court and gives the orders. It's his command, so to speak.
Do you think there's too much court life nowadays?
No, I don't think there is, because they've simplified it a great deal. I've seen very little of it, but from what I hear, and I have been around, been to Britain from time to time, and I think that it's very good now. It's simplified. People haven't got the time for the old ceremonials or lengthy ceremonials that they used to have.
When you were Prince of Wales, you had definite ideas about how you ought to dress. For instance, you didn't want to wear a top hat. You wanted to wear a bowler hat.
My father always wore a top hat, and he was surprised that I wouldn't follow his tradition. But when he didn't have to go around the big industrial plants that I did, and go around, which Thank God there are not so many today, but what we used to call the slums. They were really bad in those days.
I remember. At what point did you first become aware of coming into conflict with the government of the day as a result of your different conception of kingship?
Well, actually, that was before I became king. I had a trip organized to go and visit some of the depressed areas. I went to Wales and different parts of Britain, and this one, I think, was up in the Northumberland. And when Stanley Baldwin got to hear of this trip, he called me to the House of Commons and said he'd like to talk to me about it. And he said, "Why are you going up there? Got a lot of other important things to do?" So I said, "No, Mr. Baldwin," I said, "I think that it is very important to see how we can't give these people unemployment. Some of them have been out for 10 years. Now, Mr. Baldwin suddenly became conscious of the fact that he and his government had actually done very little to alleviate the plight of the unemployed, of which there were thousands at that time. So he said, "Who suggested that you should go?" I said, "As a matter of fact, I'm going under the auspices of Sir Alexander Leith, who was chairman of the Conservative Association in Northumberland." "Oh," he said, "wonderful man, great friend of mine. I'm delighted, and I do hope that you will have a good trip." When I left he was Prime Minister at that time, I thought to myself that he was beginning to drag me in to politics a little too far. And as we all know, politics is the one thing that the royal family has to avoid, even however much they might like to express their opinions.
There was another occasion when you were going to visit some area in which there was a great deal of poverty and unemployment, and they wanted to take you round in a Rolls Royce.
Yes.
But you refused to go.
I didn't think it was a suitable vehicle for that trip, and I upset one of the dignitaries who met me there, had his Rolls Royce for me to get in. I said, "I'm sorry, I'm not going to ride in that." And he was very upset and thought that I was letting him down, I think, more than letting my position down. I went around in an ordinary car and thought it was more suitable.
What was the occasion, sir, when you went to some area of unemployment and poverty, and you were reported in the newspapers as having said it was damnable and something ought to be done about it?
Oh, I think that it could be almost anywhere. South Wales, or... I really saw some terrible things when you look back. Those days of the 20s and early 30s, well, really until this last World War.
Did you try and do something about those conditions?
There wasn't very much that I could do, except to bring it to the notice, we say, of the government in power. At one occasion, I was as Prince of Wales. I had some of the Duchy of Cornwall. There was a big real estate property in Kennington, and one or two people in the City of London, wealthy people, got interested and said, "We'll like to put some money up to develop this, tear down the slums and build a housing estate." We got an architect. We had a meeting where I lived at York House in St. James's Palace. And I think that the chairman of the London County Council at that time was Herbert Morrison. So we had this meeting, and I think afterwards we had either a cup of tea break, or a drink. And when he was leaving, Mr. Morrison was just getting into his car, and he came back. He said, "Oh my God," he said, I've left my briefcase in the dining room where we were sitting." He said, "I can't leave the socialist secrets in this house." So I said, "Mr. Morrison, they'll be perfectly safe here."
But you didn't get much change.
No, the London County Council did not wish this group, private enterprise group, to get the credit for having built this housing scheme, which actually we could have done very much cheaper than the London County Council did.
You've mentioned one or two statesmen of your lifetime, sir. You mentioned Baldwin. What about some of the others now? How did you get on with Lloyd George?
I got on fine with him. He was a very colourful, wonderful man. He taught me very few words of Welsh that I had to speak at the time of my investiture at Carnarvon in 1911.
What kind of dealings did you have with Winston Churchill?
Oh, Winston was a great friend of mine. I knew Winston first when he was First Lord of the Admiralty in Liberal government in 1910 or 11. And we kept very close touch even while he was in power.
Did Winston Churchill give you any help with your speeches?
Yes, after the punctuation of the phraseology and so forth. And he said a very good way at a public dinner is to put a finger bowl down, and then you put a plate over the finger bowl, and then you put a glass on the plate, and then you put your notes on the glass. But he said, don't do what I did once and knock the glass over.
You remember your father advised you not to put jokes into speeches.
Yes. His old secretary, Lord Stamfordham, I asked him to help me with a speech, and he put in quite an amusing little paragraph, which had a great success in the audience. Some public dinner, I guess it must have been. And my father read this speech, sent for me, and he said, I'm very surprised that you made those rather flippant remarks in your speech to this association. Said, I've never made a joke in a speech. Well, I thought that perhaps he probably lost a good deal and hadn't pleased his audiences as much as those who can get a laugh out of them. And you could always get a laugh out of an audience early, and you can say the serious things afterwards.
I wonder what your father would have said about Prince Philip.
I think that any audience that Philip talks to would be very disappointed if he didn't have some jokes and maybe some fairly forceful criticisms as well.
MacDonald, did you have much to do with Ramsay MacDonald, sir? Wasn't it he that wrote a letter to ask you to take more care when you were out riding?
Oh, yes, asked me to stop steeplechasing, yes. Well, I was very polite, and I said I quite understood what he meant, but I didn't heed him very much.
Did you ever win at steeplechasing?
Yes, I won 13 races.
And he wanted you
Not
to
as
stop?
good as Fred Winter.
He'll be relieved to hear that.
What?
He'll be relieved to hear that. But he did write to you and ask you if you would...
Yeah, he came to see me. Mm-hmm.
What did he say?
Oh, he said that he didn't think in my position I should risk my neck.
But you just went on?
I'd had quite a bad fall, yes. I'd had a bad fall. And in those days, we didn't wear the crash helmets that are imposed today. Just had a silk cap, so there was no protection for your head at all. You were unfortunate to hit the ground hard. It wasn't so good.
And other leading politicians of the day, sir. Jimmy Thomas, for instance.
Jimmy Thomas became quite a friend of the family. My father enjoyed his company a great deal. And when I became king, while I was king, he got into some political trouble. And he had to resign from the cabinet. I think he was minister, Secretary of State for the Dominion Affairs those days. And he had to come to deliver up his seal of office. And so he came into my office at Buckingham Palace, and I shook him by the hand, and he sat down quite unceremoniously before I'd even motioned a chair for him to sit. And he looked at me with tears in his eyes. He said, "It's all a bloody conspiracy." And then he added in a very charming way, he said, "Thank God your old dad never got to hear of this." Very touching story. He's a wonderful man.
What were your first impressions of the United States?
I went to America first in 1919, November 1919, when went to Washington and paid a call on President Wilson, who was then he was then bedridden. He'd had his stroke and was very shortly before the next election. He was suffering from overstrain from the fact that the Senate wouldn't come into the League of Nations. I went to New York, and the mayor was an Irishman, the name of Hyland, and I invited Mayor Hyland to lunch with me. I went to see him at City Hall, and he refused, and for political reasons. And so the newspaper men said, "Mr. Mayor," he said, "Your Honor," as they call him, they said, why did you refuse the Prince of Wales's invitation to lunch?" He said, "Say, boys, you know I never lunch." Well, the Irish situation was not very good at that time, and he had his Irish politics in mind. But I've traveled, well, since Dutch and I were married, I've traveled a lot in America.
I remember
the country, and very invigorating. I like going there for the golf. I'm a very, very, very poor golfer, unfortunately. I once shot a 75 about 14 years ago, but that's, I'm afraid, the last good round, really good round that I ever had. My father's great hobby was shooting. He loved to shoot. He was a very good shot. And I always preferred the fox hunting. It's a wonderful sport. In my time, they used to call it the sport of kings. And I think it gave you added prestige, the fact that you enjoyed it and rode well. And I think after the Member of Parliament, the Master of Hounds, MFH, as they call them, was the great high dignity in each county or wherever the hunt was situated.
But the members of the royal family don't hunt today.
Well, I saw my great niece, Anne, last year, and said to her, I said, I know you ride, and very well, and I'm so glad that you enjoy riding as much as I did. But I said, why don't you ever go fox hunting? And she said 2 words, blood sports. So I thought to myself, well, what a pity.
When you look at the world today and compare it with how you saw it as a young man, What are the main changes that you see?
I think that the scientific progress is one of the extraordinary things in it, especially in my lifetime. World wars or any wars are terrible things, and I have seen two. But there are two things that benefit, if you can say, or can make progress on account of wars. One of them is medical science, and the other is aviation. I flew in a very primitive, no, I didn't pilot the plane, but I flew over the lines in the First World War, somewhere about 1916.
What did the war teach you?
Oh, it taught me to mix with all manner of people who I don't believe I would have been able to mix. It would not been so easy for me to have mixed before. The rough and tumble of war, they say, and there's no respecter of rank or birth.
I remember you telling me the first time we met that you were a king who collided with the establishment, and that since the king is the peak and main pillar of the establishment, such a situation was quite intolerable. What do you mean by the establishment, sir, in that context?
Well, the establishment was a new word to me until about 15 years ago, when I heard it and I asked people to explain it to me. It's not easy to explain. It's rather an obscure word, but it must have always existed. I think it means authority of the law, of the church, of the, well, I suppose the monarch, to a certain extent, and universities, and maybe the top brass of the Navy and the Army. And I was reading an article about it some 2 or 3 years ago, and it said, now, for example, Prince Philip is not really a member of the establishment. In other words, he goes out very much on his own. And then a little lower down it said, and when I come to think of it, nor was the Duke of Windsor. And I think that's very true. My father certainly was, and my brother was. But it's...
Why weren't you?
Because I was independent. I did follow I mean, I didn't rebel against the establishment, but...
You collided with it?
To some extent, I did, to some extent. Not very violently.
Do you think that collision with the establishment, sir, would have been inevitable, even if your marriage had not been involved?
I think that it would have... I think it would, yes, inevitable, and I think it would have been fairly obvious.
Even if you'd remained a bachelor, you might still have collided with the establishment?
Yes, definitely. But not in a bad way. But and I think maybe, I don't know, perhaps I'm being conceited, but I think it might have helped the establishment too.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, I think that it might have revived the thinking of the establishment. I mean, the establishment has a conservative aspect, I think.
And you mean that unless the conservative establishment is, as it were, revivified every now and again, then it's liable to perish?
Well, I think it revivifies itself. But I think that it probably does need some lead from the monarch.